Let's welcome our panelists. The first panelist is the CEO of the State Library of WA, the building in which we now find ourselves. It's Margaret Allen. Our next panelist is an associate professor of UWA. She's been at Cambridge, Brussels, and New York City, but now we've got her back. She deals with issues of privacy, technology, and artificial intelligence. It's Julia Powles. And our final panelist is a linguist at the University of Sydney. His latest book is this one, How We Talk, the Inner Workings of Conversation. He's at the University of Sydney. It's Professor Nick Enfield. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you.
I wanted to start with this theme of truth decay. We seem to be in a situation which has sometimes been called the post-truth age, an age where facts are more available than ever before, but they just don't seem to be sticky, or they seem to run aground of social groups or institutional support. I was wondering if we could just take a quick moment and ask you about your work and how this pertains to what you do, how the post-truth age influences what you do. Why are you a good person to talk about this topic? Margaret, can you start us?
Okay. Well, I guess that comes to the core of why we have chosen for Disrupted for this year the topic of truth. Libraries deal and have dealt all of our, existence in information, in knowledge. With the recent democratisation of being able to publish knowledge, write knowledge, get it out really easily to the world, to community, I guess we like to think of ourselves as being a place where actually we can be trusted in terms of the types of information that we make available. That's not to say that we don't try and tell all sides of a story, but we do try and make sure that the information that we're providing to people that come looking for it has some sense of gravitas behind it, has been, edited, reviewed, that sort of peer-reviewed, that sort of thing. So for us, we take the provision of information and freedom of access to information really, really seriously, and as I said, all sides to it, but it's making sure that we're not, if you like, knowingly perpetuating falsehoods or fake news in that sense, just for the sake of it. So that's really why we chose truth as the topic. I think it's really something that we're all struggling with every day in our life at the moment. What is truth? How do we perceive truth? What's our role in perpetuating truth or otherwise? So I reckon that's why I'm here.
Thank you. Professor Powles, I'm curious about how your work fits into this and the intersection of law and technology. There's a lot of stuff to chew on here.
Absolutely, yeah. So I spent a lot of time thinking about companies like Google and Facebook that have positioned themselves as merchants of truth and perhaps complicating this idea of that's exactly what they do, because I think a lot of how they work is to prioritise information that's popular rather than prioritising veracity. And I think also this notion of democratisation is really interesting. They use it as a mode of evading regulation and kind of the ways in which broadcasters and publishers have had sort of oversight of their claims around truth and ensuring balanced perspectives and so on. So a kind of interrogation of how these companies that I think we engage with every day, they are part of us and we're part of them, and the way that they play into this whole sort of landscape of post-truth and so on. And I was in the UK around Brexit, moved to the US around Trump, arrived here for our election.
It's like when it rains and someone visits you, you say, oh, you brought the rain. Well,
Yeah.
what did you do? Professor Enfield, we're both linguists, so we got a language thing in common, but you're also spending quite a bit of your time lately looking at this post-truth. I almost hate saying the term like it's a cliche or something, but this is what you've been doing. What's that been like?
So I'm at the University of Sydney, and we set up something called the PostTruth Initiative a few years ago, and we were really concerned about the problems that you're mentioning and that you two have just raised. It was after Brexit, it was after Trump, and there was a lot of discussion. Post-truth was the word of the year.
Yes, it was.
I think it was 2016. So a number of us at the University of Sydney who were in research were quite concerned about what was going on, and we, at university, we are all about trying to generate new knowledge, trying to discover new facts that are going to be useful for various purposes. And so a number of us got together and said, look, we really need to try to kind of get our heads together and think about what this problem is. Is it affecting us at university? Are there ways in which we can combat it? So we set up the initiative, and in fact since then we've changed the name of it. So you just said that,
I knew it.
The post-truth term is somehow, you don't really want to say it. I think that term's getting dated now already. It's anything that's been the word of the year is going to be dated pretty quickly. And it's also a term that gets misinterpreted and can be a little bit of a distraction, as if truth could ever go away, as if there could ever be a period after truth. So sometimes I think the claim to post-truth is a bit of an exaggeration. Truth's obviously very important to all of us. So the initiative is now called the Sydney Initiative for Truth, otherwise known as SIFT. And we bring together political scientists, media people, quite a few people in the social sciences, but also people in other areas of science who are looking, for example, at things like commercial influences on research in the medical field, or looking at fabrication of scientific publications and the impact that has. So what all of this has in common is really trying to defend and sort of keep sound the basic mission of research.
SIFT, that's a very good name. It
Do you
suggests
think so?
careful searching. I've been thinking about this topic as we've been going on, and I'm not exactly sure where we are. I mean, it does seem frustrating, like people don't care about facts sometimes, or that facts maybe are known, but they're not sticking somehow. But this has always been the case. People have always enjoyed delusion. Sometimes delusion has always been more popular over facts. People have always formed what I call communities of unreason. And in fact, these communities have been, in the past, much more popular than they are now. People used to define themselves according to their communities much more than they do now. At least the community that someone might belong to now might not have a name, and they always had names before. So are we really dealing with a different situation now? Or is this just more of the same? If we're living in a post-truth age, what's different now than how it's always been? Oh, stop them. Oh, man.
Who are you asking? I'm sure we all...
I'm asking everybody. Don't all break in at once.
Okay, I'll go. I think probably what is different is the communication channels, and technology, social media has made it probably much easier to connect with those people. We know that Google, Facebook, they tailor what you see. They give you what you want to see. They don't give you the alternate facts or the other view. So it's much easier, I think, to find that community of like-minded people anywhere across the globe, as opposed to perhaps just in your local neighbourhood. So I think technology has changed the way these groups can come together and form, and how they can get their message out. Because in a way they continue to preach to the converted because of the way the algorithms work and refine themselves, and just that echo chamber.
I heard that when there's a thing that happens, I was thinking of YouTube, it's a lot easier to put out a phony video that doesn't require any fact checking. And then you get it out there, and then your video, because it's the earliest, is the one that gets reshared and directed, that people get directed to. I don't know if that's true, Julia. Maybe that's one for you. Is that?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's interesting. I do think there's a long history to the appeal of delusion, and some of my colleagues who work in misinformation have looked at the ways that particular groups have really played on our selective outrage about certain topics to maximise their message. And there's a way in which I think there's a real obligation on traditional media channels to ensure that they're not just, they're in that same chase to be the first, and that they're not just picking up and amplifying messages that are designed to go at large. So I worked for some time at the Guardian newspaper, and there were lots of debates around the ways that, in covering terrorism incidents, for example, how you would ensure that it is the thing that we want to be selectively outraged about, but how do you ensure that you don't, in that process, amplify recruitment strategies and so on. And so there's this concept of strategic silence around certain issues to ensure that now we have many sort of far-right commentators, some of whom were in that sort of Brexit phase and then have been in the US, and they have messages that is designed to get kind of clickbaity titles and so on. And so how do you respond to it to cover that but not amplify it? I think it's really challenging. And the dynamics of how the traditional media sort of interplays with it is very complicated.
But doesn't that take just an uncommon degree of restraint to sit on it and to be moderate when was it Mark Twain or was it Nelson Mandela who said that a lie can be halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on? And boy, being able to just take things calmly and deliberately at an established news outlet must be really difficult when everyone else is rushing out their pieces, maybe some of dubious veracity. How do you, is there a frustration among those who do this business?
Yeah, and I mean, I saw the way that the team would try to ensure that stories that were important got attention at the same time as you had the stories that people want to click on. It's a great battle, I think. But sometimes the way that it would get played, so one of the things about writing which is incredibly frustrating is your headline is always written by a different person. So you write a story and you hate it by the time it's published because it has a terrible title. But you can use that to your advantage in some way because you go for the title that actually attracts people to the story and then tell them more nuanced story around it. But I think there's a great challenge in whether you even cover some stories at all.
I think one of the issues is framing and really sort of if we're talking about news right now, the question being, what news is about. And part of the problem is that it's a lot of the time about entertainment. It's about, you're reading something for fun or passing something on to someone else to make them smile or get them sort of outraged or whatever it is. So there's a sense of, a lot of consumption of information is not necessarily about getting facts that people are then going to act upon, right? They're about sort of, looking at things that are interesting to us or sort of fun for us. So we're not necessarily interested in whether a lot of things are true or not true. It's more, are they interesting? And oftentimes, outrageous things, sensational things, lies, those are the things that make people want to pass them on, and hence, I think, explaining the quote that you gave from Mark Twain or whoever it was.
It was Marilyn Monroe, actually.
Yeah. So, but I wanted to come back to that question that you started with. which was about, has there been this kind of problem forever? And it's clearly true that as long as we have had language, we've had the possibility of lying. So people have always been able to lie, they've always been able to mislead, they've always been able to, create rumours. And I agree that, the information economy is what's kind of transforming this. But the other sort of question that you raised, or point that you raised, you said something like people aren't that interested in the truth. And I disagree with that. Okay. I think that people are deeply interested in the truth when it comes down to things that matter to them, right? When things have direct consequences to them. They care whether the mushrooms they're about to eat are not poisonous mushrooms. They care, that the liquid they're about to put into their car is petrol and not diesel. They care that that their loved ones aren't lying to them. So people really do care deeply about the truth in relation to things that are directly relevant and within a kind of a circle, if you like, of direct relevance to their own everyday life. And I think the problem is trying to expand that circle and get people to have more regard for the truth in relation to things that are not sort of affecting their everyday life.
Okay, but then there's been a few things in my life that I've gotten really, really wrong. And I once belonged to a community of, this is really important to say. We're not just standing up here saying we get it right all the time, all right? Some of us have been really, really wrong at some times. And I have belonged to a community of Unreason. And there are certain, you care about the truth. That's why you're in, because you think that what you've got is true. But to keep you thinking that the thing is true, there are a number of ways that you use to prevent yourself from changing your mind. There are lots of ways to prevent us from changing our mind, and sometimes that's because we would lose our place in the social community. We would have to change, and who likes to do that? Sometimes we made certain commitments that would be difficult to undo. So, and there are thought-terminating cliches, like the way that a certain world leader once used a good term, fake news, and upended it to mean anything that I don't like. Right. So, and these are called thought-terminating cliches, and there are lots of them. So yes, people do care about truth, but the defense mechanisms to prevent us, to block us from changing our minds are strong and very human, and they've been around forever too. How do we change minds? We talk about putting information out there, and that's certainly very important. But have you found that there's a role for persuasion? How do you change minds? Have you been good at this?
The pleasure, working in a university environment is fantastic for, I think, one of the pleasures of teaching is you get the constant challenge of students, right? And
you couldn't ask for a better, right? They've come here to you saying, change my mind, I'm ready.
Yeah. But it's interesting because even in the university environment, there's a lot of, the whole no platforming debate exists in university settings where there's a kind of resistance, often student-led resistance to certain speakers being even in university environments. And the way, in the UK, there's a prominent strategy called Prevent, which is about ways of thought that we think might be a government strategy to prevent ways of thought that might be radical. And that is very cumbersome for debates that you really want to have where you can be as open as possible to where people's, pre-existing communities of unreason might exist, and then you can challenge them in an open sort of forum. I think universities are the place where we can have this kind of, and education generally, and kind of lifelong learning. But even in those environments, there's, I think, a lot of pressure.
Okay, so we want to be open. So let's talk about universities for a second, because we want to be open. We want to have a good exchange of ideas because we have this idea that by having free and open exchange of ideas, that the best ideas will float to the top. This is not true. What if this was untrue? What if promoting ideas, bad ideas, made more recruits? Because I think this happens.
There are different ways to kind of approach. There's a difference between, you just asked how do you persuade people. So I think one way to go is, you have a culture of intellectual humility that exists in an ideal sort of scientific environment. Okay, so that really, the rules of that game are, if an idea is bad, it will lead to wrong conclusions. You can test whether the idea works. You can get empirical evidence. You can get data. You can get, results, and you can evaluate, right? And if it's a proper, context of intellectual humility, then you go, gee, I was wrong. I revised my belief, and we proceed. So that's one kind of a game, if you like, that we can play, and that's what universities are about, and that's what research is about. I think the other approach is in persuasion is marketing, and that is, so if you really want to answer the question how to persuade people, you go talk to marketing people, go talk to people who sell washing powder and cigarettes and cars and things like that, and they know the tricks, right? And that's a different game. That's a game that says, the truth is not what matters here. What matters here is, can I get people to change their minds and act upon that new belief, like this is the best car, or if I have this car, people are going to like me, or I'm going to be cool, or whatever it is. And what you're doing is changing people's minds in order to act in some kind of way. So marketing is get them to open up their wallet and pay some money. So that's not what. That's the end of the story in marketing in a way, and then they'll drive their car around or show off their gear and other people will want it. But, the research culture is different in that way. That's a true, if it's working right, it's a true culture of intellectual humility where you want to be challenged by views that aren't the same as your own, where you want to expose your beliefs to being tested, you want to be skeptical about them, and then, either defend them successfully, and of course that feels good, or acquiesce and say, actually, I was wrong. And actually, that feels kind of good too.
It does, and yet it's really hard. And I think that if there's a big culture, like a big social culture, or if there's a big partisanship culture, then it becomes super, super difficult.
Well, science is hard. No one said it was easy, whether it's sort of hard science or maths or social science. So it's not that it's easy and it shouldn't be easy. It's not an easy thing to do. And I think that's part of the real challenge here, is to get that intellectual humility into society more broadly. I think it is a kind of cultural project to try to kind of get those same values into society more broadly, where people are more interested in getting at the truth than taking a position, where taking a position on a certain topic, whatever it may be, climate change or, you name it, where taking a position is more an act of sort of stance taking or identification, rather than an act of trying to get at the truth for some practical reason.
Is that the quality that we're missing? Is intellectual humility less common than it used to be? Is that the problem? If that existed, then people would be changing their minds all the time, and it would be, I guess that intellectual mobility would have a positive effect. But boy, in a hyper-partisan era, it seems really rare. I'll leave that hanging there. Margaret, I want to ask you about persuasion. What's it look like in your domain?
Well, we don't particularly try to persuade. We try very hard, really, not to be the judge of what's right, wrong, or maybe, in that direction. So for us, it's really around supporting people to find information, to find the information that they need, and the information that tells a number of sides of a story, because there's always multiple sides. And that can be challenging, because clearly there's, there's views around what's right and wrong around these things. But for us, it's about giving people the skills, we hope the critical thinking and the critical skills to evaluate the information that they need. And you come back to that intellectual persuasion question. And for me, I think it's probably a lot around critical thinking skills, critical digital literacy skills to be able to evaluate the information that's coming their way. And for us as, in the library, well, that should start really early on. That's something that kids should be learning right from their earliest stages, is to be able to critically evaluate the information that's put in front of them, to evaluate its veracity, where's it come from, the other people that are writing it, what's their agendas, what's their links, what's their references, why are they doing it. So for us, it's about just trying to skill people, get connect people with information and help them to be critical about that.
How do you do that in a library?
Well, we a lot of the work we do is actually around literacies, and many of you would know we start with early literacy as in reading, but part of our work around digital literacies is actually around, evaluating information. Where does it come from? Don't trust everything that you see on Facebook because it's been scoped for you. It's being delivered because that's what you're interested in. You're not interested in the alternate view. So it's really just around when we help people to find information, we try and impart those skills. So it's just part of what we do.
I want to push a little bit because we've already talked about this tension in universities between open access of information. Like we do a few things in universities. We give information, but also when people persistently get the wrong answers, we flunk them. So there's a gatekeeper role, but there's also an information provider role. Now, you've made the case that for a library, you want to be sort of a provider of information, and yet you can't really abnegate or abrogate your gatekeeper role.
No, and in the past, our role's been often perceived as a gatekeeper role. And yes, we are gatekeepers to an extent because the information that we make available, we want to make sure that it's come from a trusted source, that that there is research behind it, that there is the sort of editorial oversight, and that's where the challenge is with the democratisation of information and publishing. Anyone can publish anything, and it can be given veracity by mechanisms outside that traditional way in which information was curated, collated, published, reviewed. And that's not to say that the information's wrong, but it is that question of what's behind it, what's the substance, why has it been produced, and how's it been arrived at.
So the picture that I get lately is that before the internet, there were gatekeepers, there were media channels, and there were newspapers, and there were barriers to entry, so that not everybody could get their ideas out there. And we had problems with the way that they did their job sometimes, and that was a discussion worth having. But the idea was we got to make information available, and then in the marketplace of ideas, people can choose. And that seemed to work pretty well for long enough. Now there are no barriers to entry in getting your ideas out there. You can make YouTube videos, you can publish blogs, you can put out podcasts, you can say just about anything. And I miss the gatekeepers. I miss those media channels that are now doing it so tough because they're getting swamped or surrounded by individuals. And this can be really positive, but my big fear is that the information marketplace doesn't scale, that we can't handle the torrent, and that the way that we try to manage the torrent, like by Google, which is essentially information retrieval, biggest business in the world is information retrieval, who knew? It gives us the same kinds of biases that humans already have. And it gives us, maybe the algorithms are kind of bad and they don't serve us very well. And I'm worried that we're facing a really bleak period.
Are you going to start on this one?
Is there any reason to be optimistic? Please, Julia, save me.
Well, I was just going to, I'm sure you'll have something to say about this in a moment, but I've thought a little bit about this gatekeeper problem, and I think it's worth sort of thinking about what that metaphor means. So, a gate implies a path, right, from one place to another. And when we think about what information does, it's a long, complicated path that goes across a lot of different gates, potentially, right? So, if you really want to trace the career of a claim or, a piece of information or something that you read in a book, it's been through a lot of different gates over time. So, a lot of that is beyond our control. And, it's true, there are questions about things like regulation and so on, which we can discuss. But whether there's regulation or not, whether it's the internet or you're in the library reading a book, whether you're listening to a friend telling you something, there's always this one gate that you're in control of. And that's you, your own attention, your own mind, your own understanding of what's coming in, and your own decisions about what you're going to do next about that. Are you going to pass that information on? Are you going to act on that information? Are you going to process that information in some kind of way? So we, each of us, every one of us here now is a gate in some sense. And so we all then get to be the gatekeeper to some extent. Now that's, it's easier said than done, but I think that's the essence of what the kind of culture of intellectual humility is about, is taking responsibility where we can for being a gate ourselves and being our own gatekeepers. And part of that, is about ethical and responsible handling of information. And the other part of it, I think, is about, it's another kind of literacy, coming back to your comments about media literacy, and it's what I would call cognitive literacy. It's about understanding our own cognitive foibles, understanding our own habits of attention, understanding why we get attracted to certain types of advertisement and not others, understanding why academic publications are hard to understand and newspaper articles are easier to understand. There's a lot of features that we can actually learn about and become aware of our own mental habits, if you like, that make us much better gatekeepers to control this kind of flow of information in the one place where we actually have control over it, and that's as individuals.
Well, I think one of the challenges is that the way that particularly Facebook, but social media works, and I would say they are the gatekeepers, and they do operate in certain ways, but they are masters of the attention economy, and in particular, the ways that we betray our own best instincts by following things that can capture our attention. So there are whole teams of people who work on keeping your attention on Facebook, and that is completely divorced from the things that are true or that we ought to read. They're just stay on the platform and we'll continue to serve you ads. So there's a kind of whole complementary, I think, way that you could reimagine the platforms to make more visible, make more transparent these sorts of details about source of information, about why it is that you're seeing particular stories, what it's trying to achieve in sort of surfacing a particular kind of information data. And then I think if we really were the gatekeepers, the sort of next wave, I think, of the platform would be, you actually don't just defer to one broken algorithm, but you have a choice on the way in which information is categorised. And perhaps, I think that there's a good argument in a platform like Facebook, you could have, say, 10 different, choose your own algorithm between 10 different modes of organising information, where you could say, well, today I know that I tend to read this kind of news, but today I want to see, and it's always instructive when you do this, the kind of news that people who follow this political perspective are reading. And the same stories side by side, so you can really see from traditional outlets how the same facts are presented.
The problem is motivating people to do that, right? So, if it is entertainment, a lot of people, you'll go on Facebook for fun, right? You check out what your friends are doing, you don't want to be confronted. Some people do if that's what if you've decided, if you've made that commitment, but this is part of the problem, is if you're consuming information as a way of entertaining yourself, as, if you actually prefer to have stuff that's in your bubble, well, it's gonna be hard to get people motivated.
All right, well, I did that. There was a thing on Facebook where I think it was called Red Feed, Blue Feed or something like that, because I tend to travel in American circles. I don't know if you've noticed. I have an American accent. But I did take a look at what people on the other side of the aisle were reading, and it was absolute garbage. I've never been so disgusted. The kinds of garbage those people want to read was utterly offensive. Am I doing it wrong?
Yes.
Because okay, I'm going to press this. I know that I don't think everything right, and I know that I have been really, really wrong before. But boy, after doing that experiment, I came away thinking, I haven't been too hard on these people. I've been far too generous. And I know that the tendency is, and this is kind of my mindset as I was preparing for this, I was thinking, changing your mind, fighting truth decay. That's really good for those other people. Not necessarily for me, because I think I'm not all right all the time, but I'm about 70 or 80% there. Okay, but now I'm realizing, I could be wrong about a lot of stuff, and I could change my mind on. If the stars were right, I could change my mind, I hope.
I think the problem is about whether you're being selective or not. If you're just going to read everything in a feed that's coming from, ex-political perspective, there's no kind of quality control, right? And that you're not sort of controlling for whether the people who are writing the things you're reading are experts in what they're talking about. So I think that, expertise is one of the real kind of issues here, and it's one of the victims of this whole trend, really, is that if you can get on the internet and voice your opinion and talk about what you believe, then everyone's an expert. Therefore, nobody's an expert, and that's one of the big problems of all of this, is that our trust in expertise has gone down and down and down. And people up here have been talking about trust in journalism, but trust in whatever it is, you name it. Why should I believe the doctors who say that it's smoking's bad for you? Nigel Farage said it was fine. So I'm going to keep smoking. And I think that's one of the real problems, that if you were really going to try to challenge yourself with views from a different political belief or what have you, the first thing you'd have to be able to do would be to take steps to make sure that the person who is espousing those beliefs for you to consume is actually someone who's well informed, someone who's actually using proper habits of reason and argumentation, who's not just giving you an opinion. I mean, there's got to be this level of quality control. So it's not a simple matter. It's not just a matter of go and consume anything that's being produced by someone of another persuasion.
What if they're not? What if the best thinkers on the other side of the aisle from me are not good reasoners? What if there really is no there? I have begun to suspect this. Am I wrong? I'm being really revealing here.
What would that mean? So, I mean, it might mean that, so I think it's widely held that human beings are capable of reason, capable of argument, capable of taking on information and processing it and coming to conclusions. These are things that we can all do if we apply ourselves. So, we know that there's sort of individual variation among the capacity that people have for doing that, but are you implying that, people of the other political party actually have worse reasoning abilities and they're less capable of actually applying reason?
Well, in my home country, there's one party that wants to help people, I think, although imperfectly. They may be a bit silly sometimes, but they really do want to govern. And the other side seems bent on the destruction of everything. That is the way I see it, and I know that my view is partly a function of the media I consume, but also in my fair-minded moments, I try to say, okay, what if I'm wrong? And I just don't see it.
Well, I think maybe others can comment on this, but this is a rather sort of catastrophizing kind of interpretation of what other
Nick,
people
here we are.
But I think this is going back to the point I was making earlier on about sort of putting things in perspective. If you just read a Twitter feed from somebody, or if you just read Facebook posts by somebody, then you're going to get a sense that they want to destroy things, or some sort of view like that. But if you go to their home and you look at how they're dealing with their kids, or you go, to be with them and their families, or look at what they're doing in the workplace, then you're going to see variation across people and how they are. But people are still going to be interested in things like, is this food that they're giving to their kids good food or not? And that may or may not kind of correlate with other sorts of political beliefs and so forth. But life is much, much richer than what we put in our online life.
Okay.
Right, and I think it's really crucial to not forget that and to keep that, in mind when we talk about how interested people are in the truth or the quality of the things that they say or think.
Okay, so Nick is talking me down a little bit here. Julie, I want to go over to you. Maybe you can talk me back up again, because you focus on AI and tech and things. Can you tell me something about the way that our tech companies like Facebook, Twitter, etc., the way that they work, are they doing better, or are they still engaging in shocking practices? I know that they're starting to take on, for example, fake news. I went through an airport and Facebook was running a big ad saying, fake news is not our friend. And signaling an intention to begin gatekeeping a little more strenuously. Is that true, or is this just
marketing?
Marketing.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the dynamics about the relationship between tech and traditional institutions and individuals is actually that sort of the ways that they amplify voices helps this dynamic that you're concerned about, because there's a way in which, certainly how every time I was outside my Cambridge or NYU bubble and was really trying to engage with and understand people from different political perspectives, there was an attachment to, well, whatever this person says, in a way that I can get in a very direct way. There's no mediation. They put it on Twitter and I read it, and there's no institution in the way of moderating that message. I believe everything they say. And that, I think that's a very common theme now between the Trump dynamics and the Boris dynamics, where you have a kind of a sense of an unfiltered connection. And how tech companies, I think, imagine the future of information dissemination is that there's no interest in publishers or in institutions that will contextualize individuals within a broader, stated perspective, like a left-leaning media outlet presenting, a bunch of individuals. It's only about the individual and a sort of individual to the audience in a direct conversation with speakers. And partly how they do that is also to atomize journalists within publishing houses, so that there's a lot of the ways that Facebook and Twitter are proposing to respond to truth decay is to credit the line of editorial oversight of individual journalists, say, or individual speakers. That's the tick on Twitter, and you'll see it with stories that say this editor saw this piece and so on. But I think it's really a dangerous trend, because there's such strength in the way that a publishing house can actually insulate and verify and sort of bring that whole back end of oversight to stories and to publications. And so that's one aspect of it, I think, is that it's this sense of an unfiltered and very true narrative between influencers and political figures and so on, having a direct connection with their audience is very powerful, but dangerous as we sort of abolish the institutions in between.
It's also worth commenting that people like, organisations like Twitter or Facebook, the idea that they should be making these decisions about regulation and they should be sort of promoting, anti-fake news and all that kind of thing. I mean, we would all like to see that happening, but there's a serious conflict of interest, right? It's pretty basic. So they're the ones who are making money from clicks. And so, it's not really in their interests to reduce the number of clicks if that's what fake news does, or, other, kinds of sensationalism or whatever it may be does. So, it just doesn't make any sense for them to be, taking responsibility for regulation given that conflict of interest.
Margaret, over to you. You've been doing the Disrupted Festival for a really long time, and I would really like to hear some insider talk about what goes on behind the scenes and why we do this. I mean, it is fascinating. It's a great weekend, and I really enjoyed it. I think this is my third one that I've been involved with. What's going on? What are you trying to accomplish here?
Okay. Well, yes, this is festival number 6, and it's been on a journey. But the original discussion that we had around the table was, traditionally people interact with the libraries in a passive sort of way. And libraries have always been about information and knowledge and ideas, but mostly it's been a passive interaction. So we'll build it, we'll stock the books, and you will come and you will, partake of the knowledge and you'll think about it. And that's not the way, like it or not, that knowledge and information is being transmitted and shared and built and tested. That, the internet, social media has completely tipped that on its head. Yes, that still happens, but it's not, for a lot of people, that's not how they get their information, right or wrong. So it was really around, well, how can we, in a way, take the ideas that are inside our collections and find different ways to engage with people around it. So this is how Disrupted was born. It was around just thinking about particular topics that might be of interest. And I think truth, if I look at the people here over the weekend, truth is really struck a chord, I think, in terms of it's an issue that we're all grappling with. So what's a topical thing? What can we do? How can we engage people in that? Luckily, a lot of the speakers that we have are authors as well. So, we're also promoting that really traditional role around books, and books are still very much at the heart of what we do in reading. But it's also around other ways with which we can engage in the ideas and knowledge in our collection and enable people to think about it and make up their own minds.
And is it doing what you want?
I don't know. I think that's not a question for me. I think it's a question for the audience, honestly. Is this the sort of thing that you want us to do? Is this what you expect your library to do? Thank you.
Then let's bring it back to the individual. One of the things that I really like that's coming out of this discussion is the idea that the tools of reasoning, the tools of thinking, are not things that you take out and beat other people with. They're things that you really have to use yourself in your private moments. You've got a mic. Give us some help. What advice would you have? And if you want to dip into your own social media behavior, I would love to hear about that, because this seems to be about social media a lot. How do we, each of us as individuals, make the step to making the changing of our minds less painful? And maybe how can we influence others in our social sphere?
I'd say one way to start is to not be too impulsive, to sort of take a moment, particularly when it comes to sharing things and liking things and so forth, pause for a second. Because one of the things that I think is one of the most important kind of problems that we have with our kind of reason is this thing called confirmation bias. And that is where, we have a certain belief, we tend to hold beliefs, we come into a situation holding a certain belief, and we're always looking for evidence to support that belief. We're never looking for evidence to go against that belief or to make ourselves, change our minds. And this is one of the things that we really have to, that's what science is about, is really sort of not seeking to confirm what we already think, but seeking to disconfirm it. So some of the sort of slip-ups that you see on social media are often based around something like that. So an example is from a retweet that, or a tweet that the author Decay Rowling did some years ago of a very short bit of video of Donald Trump in the White House greeting some guests. So there was a kind of a family and some people, just sort of, some adults and some children standing in the Oval Office, and he was kind of greeting them. And it's just about like 10-second clip. And in the clip, you see Trump walking along, shaking the hands of people. So he's standing up at full height. And there's a little boy in a wheelchair who is holding up his hand to Trump, holding up the hand, and Trump, it doesn't look down, doesn't look at the child, just keeps shaking people's hands and just walks off, holds his hand out, leaves the room. And J.K. Rowling tweets this little clip and says, look at Trump. This is the one who mocked a disabled reporter, and he won't even touch this little boy in a wheelchair as if he's afraid to catch his condition. Boom, and it gets tweeted to, I don't know how many 100,000 followers she has. It gets retweeted 50,000 times. And within a very short time, it turns out that if you look at the slightly longer clip, don't get me wrong, I'm not defending Donald Trump, but this is, it's important to get our facts straight, right? If you look at a slightly longer clip, which includes, 5 seconds, 10 seconds prior to that, Trump actually comes into the room, looks at the child, gets down, shakes his hand, talks to him directly to his face, gets back up, and then the clip starts that J.K. Rowling circulated. And after a couple of days, she apologised, quite rightly. And I think, you know, in the end, it doesn't all matter because there's plenty of evidence that Trump is a terrible person, and so it's not as if we needed that. You know, but I think it was important to sort of get the facts straight, and I think it's a good lesson for a number of reasons. But one of them is, why tweet that? You know, why do you need that? And it's a classic demonstration of confirmation bias. She had this belief he's a terrible person. Oh, look, this little teeny tiny clip is evidence in favour of that. I'm going to push that and use my massive mouthpiece to you know, make this go around the world. So, you know, I think there's plenty of stories from sort of social media where these kinds of things have had very bad consequences for people. But, you know, one of the bits of advice is, you know, really, are you sure that this thing that you're about to retweet is true? Are you sure that it says what you think it says? Maybe you can think of it charitably. Maybe ask yourself what would you be doing in the same situation, and then take a step back.
Unless you're willing to go to the wall for it, don't go negative.
Yeah.
And even then. Okay.
Well, I think when, you know, I like that little moment of sort of reflecting on this specific festival and the way that we do connect and communicate ideas and so on. And I'm interested in the ways that I think that with the tech companies and social media, there's a sense that I think is unique to this area and this industry of resignation and a sort of determinism about the future, that companies that are mere, you know, less than 2 decades old are going to be here forever, and that they are the 5 or 6 gatekeepers of information and truth. And I think those companies, we make them what they are.
Yeah.
And we also can touch them. Just on Friday, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission put out this 650-page report, which, having reviewed regulators trying to wrestle with big tech companies around the world, is actually a really pioneering, I think, and impressive study. And what it says, and it's important in a country like Australia where we are net importers of technology, that we wrestle with what they are doing to the public domain and the sort of dynamics of consumer markets, but also citizenship more broadly, and that we feel like we can touch them. So I guess my thing is having constant conversations about tech companies, their modes and methods, and making them more material than something that feels like an inexorable force that we can't touch or stop. And there are direct ways I think we can engage with that. Partly it's choosing to have a bit of delay in the way that we find information, and not necessarily just going for the first 3 pages of Google search results, but you know, that's something I really try to insist on with students, to really seek out different sources.
Sorry, Google search results have more than 3 pages.
And yeah, so to really see, because I think, you know, we're more lost than we ever have been without these services. And that's a real, and as they move away from just how we receive information by screens, but embedding across our entire sort of infrastructure of cities and health and education and so on, it's really problematic. So I think this is the frontier where we do have the individual coming to interface with tech. So I think being very reflective about that, but also sort of thinking in collectives about what we should do about it, and feeling empowered, because I think it's actually a really aberrant state of affairs that we have such powerful players, and it's a very recent one.
Margaret, your advice?
I'm probably one of the worst people to ask, because I don't use Facebook, I don't use Twitter, I don't use... Having said that, I occasionally lurk, but I don't have an active profile. Actually, it's a good research tool if I'm trying to find something. But I think it is that we have to take back control, and we love them, but we're now starting to love to hate them because of you know, the overwhelming, ubiquitous nature. They're everywhere in our life, but actually, could we do a whole lot of things without them? So, but I do think it's about taking control, being selective about what you do and what you don't do, and where you hop offline and where you hop back on. But the other thing that, in my mind, this whole conversation is, yes, we're talking about information, but actually a lot of the time we're dealing with emotion. And it's sometimes very hard to separate information and emotion, and so a lot of what happens, I think, is not, you know, and that's where the critical thinking skills have to come in. How much am I reacting to this or doing this because of an emotion? And they're getting very good at appealing to our emotion as much as our critical thinking. So I think, you know, it's about separating those two as much as we can, is about my only suggestion.
That speaks to me because my own personal relationship with Facebook is complicated. I dumped it about 2 or 3 years ago. I dumped my personal account and everybody on it because it wasn't any fun and it wasn't making anybody happy, much less me. But I did keep the Talk Facebook page, and through carefully curating it and getting information and staying positive, that Facebook community has been amazing and supportive, and we don't have any trolls, cross fingers, and we couldn't do the show without our Facebook community, you know? So there are some things that, I mean, yes, Facebook is terrible, and yes, there are some things that there aren't any good ways to do it in other ways. So it sounds like our advice is watch out for confirmation bias, step away from the keyboard for a few seconds, and watch out for emotional reasoning. Those are good tips. Are we going to be okay?
Yes, I think we will be. I think humans are, society's resilient. I think we'll find a way through this.
So 1 yes and 2 not sure?
Yes, I think yes. Although, you know, it will take effort and will take some kind of dedication for people to learn and overcome things, but I think it's the kind of thing where we'll look back and sort of say, you know, really, that's how we used to act? You know, when we first when our world was transformed by, you know, Facebook and Google and all that sort of thing. I mean, I think people are getting smarter quickly. You see interesting stories. I think that people are just starting to kind of catch on to some of the ways in which this information technology works. So this recent thing about the app where you look at it, you take a picture of yourself, and then it gives you a picture of how you're going to look when you're age 100 or something like this, and then you show it to all your friends. And you know, it's like these things where someone sends around a little game on Facebook saying, oh, you know, this is your superhero name. It's your mother's maiden name plus your, you know, your first pet plus your date of birth. You know, and everyone plays this thing. Well, it's a data farming exercise, right? And we're all being hoodwinked, and we're just, you know, playing this game, but it's collecting all of this data. And people are now sort of starting to talk about that and starting to see, yeah, really, they're just, you know, this is what they do. So I think people can learn from these things quickly, particularly when they come to understand the consequences, when they come to understand that they can open themselves up to vulnerability, that they're supporting these corporations, they're giving away data for free. Quickly people will begin to learn. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic, because I think that people are very capable of learning, and we learn the downsides.
I'll offer a dissent, because I was actually I'm really interested from a linguistic perspective. In the technology field, it's striking to me that as soon as you start to articulate concerns, you raise these issues, you're quickly cast as being sort of anti-tech, or, you know, a Luddite, or these other things. And there's this way in which we want to be positive about the future, almost, I think, in a way that doesn't put any conditions on it. So I'm positive if we actually wrestle with what I think is unprecedented power that we currently don't touch. But it's not going to happen without effort, as you say. So.
Okay, I told you I was going to ask for closing statements. Is there anything you want to throw out there before we take it to questions?
No.
We got to know.
Keen to hear from people.
Yeah, questions.
I would merely just sort of reiterate and emphasize the principles that I think we need to apply that are really more cultural than anything else. And one key one being intellectual humility, being quite happy to be wrong, and putting that as one of our highest values. And so therefore, adding to that a principle of charity, which is where we look at the things that other people are saying and think, well, what would I mean if I was saying that? And actually look for value in the things that we're hearing. And I think those kinds of, if we can take those steps in terms of our values around information, then I think we're going to be in good shape.
You are way nicer than I am. Let's thank our speakers and let's take it to questions. Who's up? There are folks who are floating around the room with microphones. Just raise your hand and somebody will put an electronic device into it. Speak clearly into the transmission machine.
Hi. So you talked about truth not being in the business of persuasion. And there's a concept, particularly in marketing, that reality is perception. So you spoke a lot about the need to have gatekeepers and for people to actively look out for persuasion, I guess, in fake news and the news that they're consuming. Does truth need to jump on the PR bandwagon and learn how to tell its story and engage its audiences better?
I was thinking about this exact thing. Isn't truth just good enough by itself? Isn't it enough just to be true?
Unfortunately not. So, I mean, I can comment on this, before others may want to, but we, at the University of Sydney, we have had some discussions around the question of the use of storytelling in communicating science. So, this is, communicating science falls prey to this problem because you'll often get sort of hardcore scientists saying, here's the facts, here's the information, read it, that I've done my job. And others are saying, well, sorry, you've got to, people don't just digest these things and people need to know these things and we've established that they're true, we're experts. So actually what we really should do is exploit those marketing tricks and get people to sort of understand them and be motivated to understand them. And so there's a movement within science to say, use those tricks, use storytelling, use engagement, use these kinds of, emotional sparks of emotional interest and so forth. So it is more effective. Of course, the question then is, is it ethical? Is it proper for science? You've got to be sure you're actually right before you run around trying to persuade people. But we're trying to persuade people anyway, right? I mean, even though scientists are never 100% sure of what they believe, they can be very, very sure, and they can believe that something's very important. So tricks of persuasion, I think, do have a place.
Happy with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's keep it going. Next question, please. Hello.
Thank you very much for your comments. You're obviously all highly educated people, and most of the people in this room would be interested in education and be reasoning and thinking people. But generally, the people out there, I feel often, no, that didn't sound very nice. It amazes me how many people in the wider community get taken in by propaganda. Now, you've talked about confirmation bias and tunnel vision and all those things. I understand the principles, but why the people out there that do soak in propaganda because it suits whatever their bias is, and it's so large, it affects politics particularly, and the spread of religion and other forms of influences, that it worries me greatly. What can we do about it?
Comment? Maybe I can take one. one thing that's really good to remember is that, I'm really lucky because I was really, really wrong about a bunch of stuff at one point, and I'm probably still wrong. So that's where the intellectual humility comes in. But being able to realize, this is not something that you use on other people. This is a thing you use on yourself. Make sure that you got yourself in order. And the second thing is you're never in order. You always have a bit of slop in your thinking, and you're always susceptible to those human things because we are walking around with these monkey brains that evolved on the savannah, and they overvalue certain kinds of information, like stuff that our friends tell us, and they devalue other kinds of information, like information about long-term risk, which is why we look at shark attacks and go, and then we look at climate change and we go, So recognize the beam in your own eye, I think.
Yeah, I think it's also worth saying that we need to be careful when we talk about the people out there as opposed to, some kind of category, for example, being educated or not educated. So in my work, I do research in Laos, in Southeast Asia, and I go into the hilltops and I work with indigenous minority groups who speak languages that are spoken by, groups of 300 people. Entire language is spoken by just 300 people. It's not a written language. The people have never been to school. And that doesn't mean they're not brilliant. Some of them, the people who I work with, are brilliant people, incredibly smart, incredibly good at stuff that I have no idea how to do. They understand their natural world around them. They understand a lot of the processes that happen around them. And there's variation and diversity within that group. So some people I find are much cleverer than others at certain kinds of things, just as I find, that in my, my student body, there'll be some people who are much cleverer than others, and out there, as it were, there'll be some people who are cleverer than others. So yes, there's diversity, but I don't think there's any reason to think that it correlates directly with things like whether you've had a higher education or not. So I think, I do think we need to be careful talking about.
You say highly educated like that's a good thing. It is
a good thing. It is a good thing.
It's also good to remember that people sometimes believe bad things for good reasons. And people buy into a story that gives them a place, and we all like that stuff. We all want to be leaders in our group, and sometimes, if you're in a community that believes something wrong, sometimes that's because you're acting on perfectly normal human desires. Sorry, anything to add there for that one?
Emotion and survival, and there's a whole lot of things come to mind around why you might choose to believe something as the truth as opposed to something else. And education, I would think, is one factor in that complex environment.
Have we got a bit more? Oh, sorry.
I would just follow up and say that you mentioned this sort of evolution of the human mind, and I think it's really important to emphasize that one of the strongest pressures on the evolution of the human mind is the social world. Yeah. So we know that, we had to learn how to, use tools, and we had to learn how to run away from, marauding mammoths and things like that. But actually, by far our sort of greatest pressure is understanding human relationships, working within very complex societies. And so things like signaling that I belong to this group as opposed to that group, those types of instincts are very, very important for our survival. So I think those help to explain a lot of this, emotion-driven, partisan-driven use of information that we're talking about.
Oh, I've got an idea. Then why don't we do a thing where we get all of our news from what is essentially a social network? That would be a really good idea, and nothing bad could be happening.
Hi. I was really interested in the point of view that are coming up here, and makes me think of when David Suzuki has given some of his presentations here, and he's obviously a quite well-educated man, and he's got a pretty good handle on how much we need to pay attention to this sort of spaceship Earth, life support systems, care and maintenance, and getting knowledgeable about that as part of really moving mankind forward. So I think there are priorities about what we should get smart about, and getting a part of, having the core business, or not just balancing the budget, but really putting the environment as part of the triple bottom line accounting thing, making that real, it is an important consideration of how well we think of our people getting the right picture. Instead of just saying, oh well, there are all kinds of people and so on and so forth. The priority is we need to relate to each other with respect, but also to the things that give us life here. Life support system. So what are your thoughts perhaps on this relationship thing, needing not just to be good with people, but with the stuff that actually allows us to stay here? Because a lot of we don't seem to know how to say that this is really, really important, and without that, none of the other games matter. Economics doesn't matter, human relationships don't matter, if we don't devote a bit more time to this fundamental relationship between us and the world that gives us life.
Comments?
Agreed. I think it follows from what we were just saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the changes that happened at The Guardian when it's reporting on climate change is that it's banned now the term climate change. It says climate crisis. But it's been a decade-long struggle on how to report stories in a way that appeals to people, and trying lots of different strategies. In fact, I think we haven't really talked about the medium of podcasts, but on that level where it's a very different communication that happens when people are feeling a very direct connection between a speaker and an audience. I think more exploration is kind of the oral power of storytelling and that sort of very intimate experience that you have when you hear stories. So there was this fantastic climate change series that they did, and it was this is the best podcast series that The Guardian ever did. And so that's one direct mode. I guess just a quick note on the technology and social media and so on. An element that's never mentioned about our reliance on getting information through Google and Facebook and so on is the sheer environmental cost of that. Cloud computing now occupies a significant proportion of the world's energy costs. As we move to more, we talk about technology and data and AI as if they have no environmental costs, and they have a stupendous one. So that's an aspect I think that always needs to be kept in the conversation about social media, and a good one to keep hammering.
Just a few notes before we go. Dr. Carl and Professor Alan Harvey will be coming up very soon to talk about the physiology of your brain and how reliable is our memory. There's also an hour or so left to check out the virtual Wajak in the Nook, so make sure you have a look at this locally produced VR experience. I'd like to thank you for listening, and let's give it up one more time for our panelists, Julia Powles, Nick Enfield, and Margaret Allen.